that when it came to chattel slavery and European colonization, they introduced, or they gave us the Bible and took our land, as if to indicate that there was no knowledge or indication of Christian thought prior to those eras. But I think you just delved into something that I think is of historical value there. When you mentioned that 20% had already, at least based on estimates, had some exposure to Christian doctrine.
Yeah.
What would have happened, do you think, when it came to now the Eurocentric version of Christian thought during that introduction? There must be something of historical value there that you might be able to share.
Yeah, and so actually there are some records of Christians in the South, down south in the Carolinas, etc., who were kind of forced to become Anglicans, and they wanted to practice Christianity in their own way, but they had to join the Episcopalian church, the Anglican church, etc. And so what's happening now is there is a reality that many people don't really want to embrace, and that's the reality of how culture impacts religion. So Roy Adams, for instance, Dr. Roy Adams, he used to be the associate editor for the Review. Yeah. In his doctoral dissertation on the sanctuary, which he also published as a book, he shows that the model of the sanctuary. Now we're studying about the sanctuary this quarter in the Sabbath school lesson, but the model of the sanctuary is very much like the other sanctuaries in that region.
That's true.
Okay, and so other sanctuaries in that region had the holy place, the most holy place, just like, and so why was the Israelite sanctuary like what we would call the pagan sanctuaries, etc.?
Right.
Well, because that's how people recognize that this is a place of worship. Okay, this beautiful place in which we're worshiping now. Okay, we could see the Hebrew word in here for eight yom. So we can see the Hebrew word over here, but let's look at the images over here, and I wish we could spin the cameras, but I know we're not going to do that. But this is the stained glass window here in a place that was once a Jewish synagogue. Okay, it's something that you'll find in any Catholic church, any Anglican church. Why? Because when the Jews who formed the synagogue, before it became an Adventist church, all right, when they thought about how they were going to decorate and how they were going to express, they looked and said, okay, this is how people do it here. Okay. And so they have the stained glass windows. When you go to places in the East and you see Christian churches, a lot of times that which distinguishes the Christian church from a masjid, from a mosque, is the fact the Christian church has the cross and the mosque has the crescent. And so when Africans came here, the Christianity that they probably would have practiced, those who were practicing Christians in Africa, would have been different than what they saw here. But of course, because there's this whole sense that Africans were coming from some sort of primitive background, because of course the people who enslaved them over here had no idea about the environment from which they came. The enslavers who actually visited the ports in Africa would have known that there was a level of sophistication there. And so now they're going to sophisticate these folk. They're going to introduce them to real Christianity. They're going to steal their culture. And unfortunately, after a while, Christianity becomes confused with culture. And let me back up a little bit, because, again, you cannot separate Christianity from culture. But when you get to a point where you feel that one's culture is the overarching lens through which to interpret Christianity, that's when the problem comes. And I think that's been a lot of the problem as it relates to how some blacks have chosen to reject the church, because they're looking not at the church as Christ left it, but at the church, how a certain culture shaped it.
Yes. And so, contextually speaking, what would you say to those who would opine that Christianity, in its current state and form, is whitewashed?
Well, I could say amen to that to a certain extent. Okay, because yes, what we see as dominant Christianity is definitely one, again, that's been strongly influenced by European culture. But we do know that there have always been elements of resistance. And so when we look at traditional African American worship, for instance, it's different than a lot of African worship, okay? Because it's a worship that was formed by a people who have gone through a struggle unknown to those in other parts of the world and have basically combined some of the things that were sort of impressed upon them during the period of enslavement and oppression with those things that make them feel, or at least allows them to express who they are. Okay? And so when we see the black church, we see sort of this history of resistance, even going back to the plantation. It was Albert Rapateau who, wrote about the slave religion and introduced us to I guess he would have introduced us, but of course he wrote about sort of the hush hoppers, when they would go down and worship in a way that was different than the Sunday morning worship that the slave master kind of looked over and made sure they were singing, "A mighty fortress is our God." That's what I was thinking, but when they got to that hush hop, they could stamp their feet and pat and do what they wanted to do, sort of thing, And so what we rarely have with black worship, black expressions of worship, we sort of have this resistance, wanting to sort of maintain the spontaneity that is a part of African American or African expression, sort of thing. But of course, doing something that now becomes uniquely ours. For instance, the spiritual. Okay, we call the Negro spiritual. That's something that's unique to the black experience. Okay, and so someone who is generationally Akan could not sing a spiritual like someone whose ancestors were enslaved over here. And so there's an experience that sort of births this new culture. And I think what some people may be a little concerned about is the fact that the new culture that emerges still in some ways has elements of the European culture, even though some things are definitely African, right? And it's almost like wanting to see something pure, but at the same time not realizing that if we're talking about something that is pure African, then we have sort of bought into nomenclature that the oppressor has basically invented, because what is uniquely African? There are, thousands of different cultures in Africa. Folk worship and express themselves differently in South Africa than they do in West Africa, than they do in East Africa, than they do in North Africa. Okay? And so the failure to kind of acknowledge that cultures emerge due to circumstance, and in the case of those of us whose forebears were taken here from the Africas, the circumstance would be enslavement, would be, finding ways that we can survive, we can express ourselves without being censored too much, etc. It's something that is unique. It is something that's unique. And to see certain emblems of Euro culture there is going to be expected. But having said that, the emblems of culture that I think are dangerous and what many people push against are things like, for instance, pictorial representation. Those are the things that now become dangerous because in many ways they're given the impression that Christianity is European culture. And for those who turn their backs on Christianity because they've come to that conclusion, the unfortunate thing is they have chosen to believe a lie. And so they're not rejecting Christianity, even though that's what they think they're doing. They're rejecting Eurocentrism.
Absolutely. Now that you mentioned that, and I believe my first conscious thought about blackness and Christianity, when it first aired, I wasn't born, but there was a show called Good Times.
Yeah.
and I watched practically every rerun episode. When I was a boy, and it was an episode about the Black Jesus. I don't remember the characters too well right now, but one of the characters rejected this image, this pictorial image of a black.
That was the son, Michael.
Yes, a black Jesus. I think it was the mother of Michael or something like that, and he had brought it in and had it hoisted in the living room area, and his mom was saying, well, that's not Jesus, and it's because she was introduced to a white representation of Jesus, and she said, that is the one I know. It became I really became kind of attuned to that level of thinking. I remember at that point, wondering whether or not if Jesus isn't white, then why am I being shown a white Jesus? I saw it in all of my books as a child, the storybooks. Everything had that representation of Jesus. So I'm wondering, what are some of the practical things that can be done among Christian groups where they can reconcile? Because it is a dissonance, knowing that, and like you said, it's been mistaken. Christianity has been mistaken for European culture. How do we correct that? What are some practical things that can be done to correct that?
Yeah, I know one of the things that I've done, my book, The Blessing of Africa, the Bible and African Christianity, I wrote that specifically to address this issue. And there are others that have been written, Cain Hope, Felder's Troubling Biblical Waters, and there are a number of others that are written to do that very thing. I guess the unfortunate thing sometimes with that is that, for instance, my book is published by InterVarsity Press Academic Line, so it is used in seminaries and universities, so it's not accessible to everyone. But there are some who have done some things, that kind of retell the story in a way that people can access it. But it's very important, though, that when that's done, if we have something to tell, if we're doing the research, etc., that we ensure that it's published on the right platforms in a sense, So, I could self-publish a book and I'm going to send it to my family and friends, right? Okay, but if you have something to say and you've done your research, etc., you find a publisher who is interested, get that platform out there so that more and more people can have access to these stories that have been researched and, are sort of retelling things in the right way. Churches, I think, have a responsibility to ensure, for instance, that the instructional material that they're using for the young ones in the church, reflect who the young ones are. Right. So they don't grow up thinking that they are less than. And Naim Akbar, in his work, Changing Images of Psychological Slavery, speaks about some of the devastating effects that being in the church all the time and seeing these images of white biblical characters that reflect a country club mentality of no blacks allowed, the impact it basically has, Now, there are challenges as I look at the stained glass around this building, for instance. And I'm not sure, this is probably protected. I don't know, and of course it would be very expensive to change images like this, etc. But if it's something that's permissible, maybe that's an investment that may be worth it, or if someone can come in and sort of shade a couple other people different colors or something, that can be done. Because again, one of the things I try to do, I remember doing one of the share hymn meetings. Remember?
Oh, yes.
The share hymn?
Yes.
And I took a group to Jamaica, right? And they gave us some slides that said, contextualized for the African context. I looked at these slides, the only black folk in there were, starving people with big bellies, It was contextualized for the African context. But every single biblical image was white. Yeah? Now, for one, because my evangelism is not traditional evangelism. Okay, so when I do evangelism, I deal with life issues. And so one of my series, for instance, is called Get Ready for the Revolution. So I deal with those revolutionary issues, how can we enact social justice in our communities, etc. And so I knew I wasn't going to use the standard plate that they even though Falkenberg was put in the bill. I was still going to do evangelism how I do evangelism.
Absolutely.
But I looked through his slides to say, okay, is there anything I can use? And there was not much I could use. And so what I did, I basically found images of Black Jesus, Black biblical characters, etc. And that's why I changed up my whole format of presenting so that there could be representation. What was interesting, one night after the meeting, this was like in Jamaica, all Black people in the audience. One guy came to me and said, "Excuse me, sir." I said, "Yes." He says, "Are you a racist?" I said, "Am I a what? Are you a racist?" I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "It's pure Black Jesus, Mister. Why are you showing Jesus like that?" He was actually offended that I was showing a picture of a Black Jesus.
Wow.
And I said, "Oh my goodness!" So Bob Marley came to me and emancipate yourself from mental slavery, sort of thing, like that. But what I decided to do after that, though, because it did speak to me a little bit, and so if you look at my slides now, because I was thinking, suppose I was speaking in China or India. How am I going to depict Jesus,
Right.
And so I mix them up now. So most of my Jesus images are Black, but I do mix them up a little bit because the truth of the matter is we do know for sure that Jesus didn't look like Leonardo da Vinci's cousin. I think we could say that with a 99.99999% accuracy that he didn't look like the blonde-haired, blue-eyed person who he's obviously depicted to be. But we also don't know exactly how he did look. We know how he most probably didn't look, but we also don't know how he did look. And so because I personally don't want anyone to leave a message and the only thing they see is Black Jesus and not go and feed the hungry and clothe the naked, I kind of mix things up just a little bit, just to make sure that the little Chinese kid in the congregation feels like he saw something too, a little Indian kid. That he saw something too,
Right.
But the images are very, very, very important. And I think that it is important, specifically when you're teaching your young ones, that you deliberately make sure that they are included in those images, they're included in those pictures. Also, I think it's important that people are re-educated about the biblical world. Because again, we hear the word Middle East and we think, okay, Israel, Palestine, that's, but we don't really think that, okay, here's what we call the African continent, right? Okay, and then there's the Suez Canal, a 20th century man-made canal, and that's supposed to separate Africa from the Middle East,
Yeah.
And so from a biblical perspective, this was all one land mass. Right? And so having people rethink biblical geography.
Okay.
And even asking yourself the question, when you see a geographical area referenced in Scripture, well, where could that be today? And so the first reference to a geographical area in Scripture actually comes in Genesis chapter 2. Read about a river coming from Eden, divides into 4, right? First encircles the land of Havilah, where there is gold. The second, the land of Cush, Ethiopia, and then the Tigris and the Euphrates. What's interesting is that all 4 of these areas are actually associated with biblical Cush, even though one of them said it encircles the land of Cush. When we look in Genesis chapter 10, Havilah, Babal, Asher, the areas of the other rivers, are actually offspring of Cush. So we have Cush proper, and then the other areas associated with Cush. All 4 rivers in Eden are associated with biblical Cush. And what's interesting, if you look at some of the translations of the Bible, citing the King James and others, it basically says, and comes the land of Cush, right? Which is the Hebrew Cush. And most people think of some exotic 200 years before Christ. When you look at the translation in the Septuagint, the second encircles the land of Ethiopia. Okay? So they're not trying to obscure anything.
Okay.
Okay? And so it's important that we ask questions about geography, even about names, logical questions. So we have Joseph, for instance, who was the prime minister in Egypt. Joseph, who was his wife? A lady called Potipharah. Who was Potipharah? The daughter of the priest of On. Who did she give birth to? Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay, so he's married to an African woman, African royalty, and two people from whom Israel's tribes came from. Africa.
Yeah.
You know, even Moses himself. Okay, and again, it's, you know, we really don't know exactly how they looked, but we can kind of, you know, make some deductions based upon what we read in Scripture. And so here's Moses, grew up in the palace of Egypt, right? In fact, what's interesting, his name, Moses, Moshe, one drawn from the water, is probably under one of the pharaohs named Thutmose, so he's probably named after his grandfather, right? Because Hatshepsut would have been the one who pulled him from the water. But when he flees to Midian, and his wife Zipporah, you know, he protects her from the folk who wanted to bother her, etc. And she goes back to her father Jethro, and she says, hey, this Egyptian helped me out. Based upon what she saw, and probably his language too, she said, this is an Egyptian. Or even New Testament. Acts, is it 21? Paul, the Apostle Paul. When Paul goes into the temple just before he is arrested, and there's a big uproar in the temple, and, you know, the Roman soldiers come in to calm the uproar, and Paul speaks. And the centurion, he looks at Paul and asks him a very strange question. He says, are you that Egyptian who, and he goes on. Why would he look at Paul, who is speaking Hebrew, or may be speaking Greek or Aramaic, whatever he's speaking, and ask if he was an Egyptian, if Paul did not look like an Egyptian. All right? And so these are some of the things I think that we need to sort of pull out and elevate from Scripture to show that, you know, there were folk in Scripture that probably looked like we did. Okay? And it should also be depicted in the way in which we present the art that is supposed to teach us lessons from Scripture.
Wow. That's amazing. Now, one of the things, and those are very practical insights. I do receive all of them. I think that's a good direction for us to at least start in. As I heard you share, and we acknowledge the dissonance that currently exists when it comes to accepting Christian tenets and doctrine, even as one is consciously black. As a result of that, there's been a rise, there's been an uptick in the appeal that I guess black conscious or religious sects have to Christians, namely sects in the Nation of Islam and the Black Hebrew Israelite. These have been on the rise as the level of black consciousness has risen. So as far as, I guess, appealing, and just from an apologetic perspective, what are some of the things that you think are relevant to maybe addressing the need or the perceived need in identifying with a religious group that pushes black consciousness as a part of the faith experience?
Yeah, I think, one of the themes I think we've been pushing this evening is the whole idea of not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And so I think that's something that's very, very important to know, that European garb that professes to be Christianity is not Christianity. I think that's very, very important. Don't confuse the messenger with the message. Okay? I think what's also important is to embrace could be a very uncomfortable truth that if you are going to one of these expressions of faith because, it's the opposite of what you're running from, then what are you basically doing? You are running from one sociological, cultural phenomenon to another. And so one, you're saying, I'm not worshiping whiteness, but I will worship blackness. Okay? And so again, you are wrapping something up in culture. You're just worshiping culture. Yeah? And again, we celebrate culture. I am very Afrocentric. All right? I mean, I love my reggae music. Okay? Yes. Like that, unapologetically. Yeah. Okay? And I read the books, I write the books. But I don't confuse those expressions of culture with my spirituality. Can they help me to experience spirituality? Oh, yes. But one of the dangers that we see a lot in some of these Afrocentric groups that have arisen is that they've basically replaced an image of God, an image of the divine, with another image of the divine. And let me explain it this way. So when you look at the Nation of Islam, okay, founded in the 1930s, of course, we have Dean Muhammad, and then, of course, Elijah Muhammad was the thing. But we'll read Elijah Muhammad's message to the black man in America. Also look at the main doctrines of the Nation of Islam. We see that they're very Americocentric, Afro-Americocentric, all right? And so one of the demands is that America needs to separate the land amongst the races, and black folks should get like Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, etc. That will form like the new black land sort of thing, because this is sort of heaven in a sense, right? And so blackness now becomes the central focus of everything that's important. Look at the Hebrew Israelites, okay? The Hebrew Israelite doctrine basically says that blacks, and of course Latinos are included too, and Native Americans, they say, okay, they're all descended from the 12 tribes of Israel. So we are the real 12 tribes of Israel, okay? And we are the only ones who God is pleased with. So if you're an Edomite, that's a white person or something, then you can't be included. In fact, if you are a black person who is in Africa, according to some of the camps in the Hebrew Israelites, you're also excluded too, because you're Hamites, and as far as they're concerned, the Hebrew Israelites are Semites. Okay? And so again, there's this focus again, in fact, even more narrower, not just on ethnicity, but on American ethnicity. So it's the those in in the United States of America, in the Caribbean, because the African Americans, I think, are Judah, the Haitians, Levi, something. So they have different ways in which they categorize people, etc. But the people in Africa are also the enemy; they're also excluded. And so a lot of these expressions say that they're liberating, but in many ways they're replacing one form of exclusion and oppression with another form.
Okay. And perhaps that can even be substantively a part of an urban apologetic. I'm using Eric Mason's term now. An urban apologetic that is baked into Christian faith. More expansive with this rise, because as in its current state, I don't think we have so much that apologetic, which is why there's this appeal. I'm not sure. Let me ask it this way: which do you think is of more consequence? Realizing that the gospel and Christian identity has been whitewashed, or really ignoring? Or the absence, I should say, of an urban apologetic that diminishes the attribution of whiteness to the gospel. I mean, which is worse there?
Yeah. I'm going to respond with a Twainism, Mark Twain. At least this statement is attributed to him. I can't hear what you say because what you do speaks so loudly, right? And what I mean by that, when I think about apologetics, because there is apologetics in a philosophical sense, right? My truth is better than your truth, and here's why. Okay? But Paul in 1 Thessalonians, he says to the folk, our gospel came to you not only in word, but in power, etc. So in other words, practical. Jesus in Matthew chapter 25, when he paints the scene of the great judgment, he says that the people who will hear, come ye blessed of my Father, are those who clothed the naked, who fed the hungry, who visited the sick, who made sure that those latchkey kids didn't run around hungry all night, okay, but found a place for them, who took in, folk who nobody else wanted. So I think the loudest apologetic is the witness of Christ, doing the work of Christ. And when we do the work of Christ, only then will people know that we are representing Christ. It was Christ who said, if I be lifted up, I'll draw all people to me. Right? Now, many people, when they talk about Christ being lifted up, it's lift up in the tent meeting or something. No. How do you lift Christ up? You lift Christ up by doing the works of Christ. I love what I hear, coming from Lyndon, as we're talking about loving people and doing something nice, being kind. Okay, that to me is the strongest apologetic. Okay. Doing the work of the kingdom, so that those who want to spend hours on the street corner debating with the Hebrew Israelite, go ahead and do that, but I see this homeless person out here who needs a Happy Meal. I'm going to go feed that person.
Yeah, that's powerful, Doc. That's powerful. But that kind of gives us a pivot into maybe a realm that is more, well, I guess relevant to us as Seventh-day Adventists. Because even as we consider all of that history, it has value, but then it comes even closer to home when we factor the role of Eurocentrism within our church. That's still in our church, and understandably so, because we are a global denomination. And so for those who are black, whether they're in North America or really any part of the world, there is that difficulty that they face when it comes to Christian expression.
Yeah.
You refer to some of the cultural expressions that are related to faith. And then there's a degree of suppression when it comes to those ideas and things like that. And they're constantly faced with this. And it's somewhat a part of the frustration that a lot of black communities of faith within Adventism are facing. And so, it's somewhat of a struggle. So how would you advise you can really handle, and if I would even go deeper when it comes to, let me let you respond to that part, and I'll pick up on the other end.
As you're asking the question, this song was just rising in my mind. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom of me. Before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. This was a spiritual that was sung by enslaved people. I didn't say slaves. Enslaved people, because slavery is a state of mind. And I think power over is usually power that's been granted. And so we are only controlled by the system if we allow the system to control us.
Mercy.
And so there was a time when, as an ordained Seventh-day Adventist pastor who's written a Sabbath school quarterly, taught in our schools, sat on GC committees, I would hide and listen to my reggae music. Not anymore. Who controls me? There was a time when, in fact, I'm going to share this story. I hope I don't get into trouble here, Pastor. I'm not trying to raise that thing. But it was actually at my dear cousin's wedding. That's Sharon and Robert, right? So they had some cultural expression after the wedding, right? And I remember I did the wedding service, and a cousin of mine, she came to me. She's a little girl. She says, Uncle Keith, Cousin Keith said, can we have a dance? And I said, oh, no, I can't do that. I'm the pastor. She says, I mean, that's unfair. Why can't you? She says, don't you like that? I said, yeah, I like that. I'm the pastor, you know. And so, I mean, I basically stood there watching everyone dance, wishing I was on the dance floor, you know. But then I thought about it. I'm not out there bumping and grinding and stuff like that. And so, yeah, if you know, the electric slide comes up, you know, I'm going to be in the slide. And I remember being at it was a North American division meeting some time ago. I had just come back from Senegal. I was in Senegal for a couple of months doing some field research over there. And I went to some villages, and I was dancing with the villagers, etc. And so some of the, you know, some of the department directors from the NAD were at this thing when I was presenting on my trip. And I said, you know, somehow if you look on the internet and you see on YouTube a picture of someone who looks like me dancing, I said, it's me. You know, so there was a time when I tried that, but no, because that's a part of my cultural expression. And so I refuse to allow what a cultural system defines as wrong to determine my choice of how to behave and how to express my blackness if the Bible doesn't say it's wrong. And so refusing to be imprisoned, refusing to be enslaved, and basically just making a choice to say, yes, I know this is what the church may say culturally, but from what culture is that dictate uttered? I don't have to follow it. Now, not necessarily in the terms of cultural expression that we're talking about now, but you know about the regional retirement plan, okay? All right? And it's the best retirement plan in North America for pastors. But it's a regional conference retirement plan. When Joe McCoy did the research for that plan, and this was after the church changed from what we call a defined benefit retirement to a defined contribution retirement, and Joe McCoy and other black folk were saying, well, we don't invest like the others because we don't have that disposable income, so we need a defined benefit plan. He went and did the research, found a plan. You know, if you do your full-time in retirement in some cases, you could be getting more in retirement than you were when you're actually working, right? And he took this plan to the North American division. Al McClure was the president at that time. And he said, listen, I've researched something, and I think this is going to be good for the entire church. He didn't really just keep it for the black pastors. He wanted everyone to experience this. And he was told by the NAD president, we forbid you to do this. And Joe McCoy said to him, I didn't come seeking your permission. I came to see if you wanted to benefit from this. This is what we're doing. It's something that you can allow everyone in North American division to benefit from, or you can choose to do what you're going to do. And they chose to do what they were going to do. And now all over North American division, people are looking at the retirement plan and thinking, wow, we wish we had that. But if Joe McCoy had said, okay, I'm going to follow you, Massa, then he wouldn't have done something that was for the best for the regional conferences. You know? And so that's the best way, I think, to really speak out against the hegemony, because it can only be hegemony if you allow folk to tell you to jump and you jump. I'm not talking about being rebellious at all. I'm talking about being free.
And I think a key piece there to freedom, as you've experienced and many others have come to that space, that liberating space, the key piece there is knowledge. And a lot of Seventh-day Adventists, black Seventh-day Adventists, won't necessarily have that level of exposure, because what have they been exposed to? Most things that have been steeped in Eurocentrism. so then where is the access so that they can have the level of freedom that you're talking about, and they can, say, yes, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, but I'm also black, and I'm fine with that.
Now, there's an easy access. For everyone who's listening and viewing this evening, or who may view the rerun, if you don't subscribe to Message Magazine, subscribe to Message Magazine. Okay? I mean, I think that's a beautiful way in which we can affirm ourselves as black Christians while not disparaging other ethnicities, etc. So that's one way. Number two, try to find out a little bit about the history of black Seventh-day Adventism. The reason, for instance, many people don't understand why we have regional conferences. I know a lot of people come from the Caribbean and other areas and like, what's all this going to, and they don't understand the roots of the problem. Find out what the roots of the issue are. Why is it that we have these parallel systems here? Okay? What was the role of black people in the Millerite movement, for instance? Okay, so we know about William Ford, and there were other blacks that were part of the Millerite movement. So dig a little deeper and find out something about your history. Even how Ellen White is portrayed. Okay, I recommend that everyone should get a copy of Dr. Thompson's Ellen G. White and Social Justice. So you can have a view of Ellen G. White that is not, you're not going to find this in the Sabbath school lessons or in any in most official church publications, but it's basically there. And Ellen G. White, who in many ways she was a creature of her day, so there were some statements she makes that do seem a little problematic when it comes to race relations, but then she was way ahead of herself in many, many other areas, to the point where she even used to divert some of their tithe money to help support black pastors because they were getting paid just a fraction of what white pastors were being paid. Okay, so these are some of the things I think that people, the material is out there, but sometimes you just got to find it. You got to find it. So definitely Message Magazine, Jonathan Thompson's Ellen G. White and Social Justice, definitely Lewis B. Reynolds' We Have Tomorrow, Calvin B. Rock's, what's the one that just came out? Calvin Rock's
Protest in Progress.
Protest in Progress. So those are some of the resources I think that can help to enlighten people's minds.
Okay, excellent. Well, Doc, believe it or not, we are almost we're practically out of time.
Wow.
And wanted to see if we had any additional questions on our chat. I believe we answered most of them while you were talking. So I was just monitoring the feed to make sure we weren't missing anyone. But the other side of that, the question that I had asked, when it came to, for us as Black Seven, it was some of the things that we can tap into. Because I hear you saying we can be charters of our own destiny.
Yes.
Our own journeys can be informed by our own diligence in seeking and accessing information. And I think that's important because there's a lot to be gleaned as we understand the level of complicity that even the Seventh-day Adventist Church would have had in the eras where racial tensions were strongest. That's a truth that cannot be denied. It does not mean that what we preach is error. Doesn't mean what we espouse is not biblically grounded, but it is our history. And I think coming full circle and giving attention to that is rather important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it is important that people know the Lucille Bayard story.
Yes.
I think it's important that people know that there was a time when if you were black in New York, you could not go to AUC, you could not go to CUC, you had to go to Oakwood, because you weren't. I think people need to know that there was a time when if you were black, you could not eat in the GC cafeteria. Yeah. It was E.E. Cleveland who integrated that cafeteria. That's right. That's another good book to read. E.E. Cleveland's, I think it's Sparks from the Anvil, I think it is. But anyway, but that's another good book to read there, And so these are things that we need to know But then we also need to know that the reason why the GC cafeteria became integrated is because E.E. Cleveland that first day, in his own unique way, when they said, we're not going to feed you, he said, I shall not be moved. Okay, and so E.E. Cleveland, they said, and
Yes.
the day after, literally,
Yes.
the cafeteria was integrated because somebody stood up, somebody dared to say something.
Right. And Dr. Rock really highlights a lot of that in his book, Protests in Progress. We progress even as we continue the
Yes.
protest.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's rather profound. Well, Doc, we really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. I am sure my soul has been blessed, and I've gleaned a whole lot. And I'm sure those who are watching online, you would have gleaned just the same. We do look forward to maybe another edition of Black and Peculiar in the future. We invite you to subscribe to the channel if you're watching perhaps for the first time, so that you don't miss future editions as well as other ministry offerings. And so we bid you a pleasant good afternoon, and we hope that you will have also a productive week. God bless.